7 p.m. and if everyone is ready, we can get started. Okay, seeing nods. Hello everybody, welcome to the March 9th meeting of the Albany, California Planning and Zoning Commission. And the first item is, I just did the call to order, and I want to read the land acknowledgement. The City of Albany recognizes that we occupy the land originally protected by the Confederated Villages of Luzon. We acknowledge the genocide that took place on these lands, and we must make strides to repay the moral debt that is owed to this indigenous people, specifically the Ohlone tribe. We thank them for their contributions, which have transformed our community and will continue to bring forth growth and unity. The City of Albany commits to sustaining ongoing relationships with the tribe and together build a better future for all that now make this their home. And now I believe we have roll call. Instead of doing formal roll call, can we just acknowledge that I see all the commissioners present? Would that be good enough?
Whatever you wish, Chair. That'd be fine.
I so do, because I see them all. Thank you. Next we'll move on to ex parte communications. Does any commission member have any ex parte communications that they need to divulge? No. And I'm seeing no head nods all around. I have none either, so we can move on to item 4, which is the consent calendar. Normally we are acted with one motion unless a member of the public or a commission member wishes to pull an item. Does any commission member wish to pull an item from the consent calendar? Not seeing any members of the commission. Let's go and see if there's any member of the public. Any member of the public who wishes to pull an item off of the consent calendar for discussion, please raise your hand now. And I'm not seeing any hands raised. Going once, going twice, going 3 times. Would someone like to, we'll bring it back to the commission.
I'll move approval of the consent calendar. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I'll second that.
Commissioner Donaldson has moved. Commissioner Waddy has seconded, and I will do the roll call. Commissioner Donaldson?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Commissioner McLeod?
Yes.
Commissioner Waddy?
Yes.
And Commissioner Moman?
Yes.
There we go. Thank you. And the consent calendar is approved. On to announcements and communications. There are none formally listed. Do we have any other last minute announcements or communications from staff or commission members? And seeing none, then we'll move on to item 6, which is public comment for persons desiring to address the commission on items that are not on tonight's agenda. Any comments that refer to items, anything that's not on the agenda tonight? Members of the public, please raise your hand if you have a comment for an item not on the agenda. Excuse me. Seeing none, we'll bring it back to the commission and close that out. No public comments, so we'll move right on to the heart and soul of the meeting tonight, which is the discussion and possible action on for items related to the following items. 7.1 is the study session to review the draft San Pablo Avenue specific plan. This is no action required. I'll note that no action is required, and this is for information and discussion only. Staff, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Yes, good evening, Commissioners. Jeff Bond, the Community Development Director. Thank you for the opportunity this evening to present to you after a number of work sessions with you over the last year or two. We have now the first complete draft of the San Pablo specific plan for your discussion this evening. I'd like to just briefly introduce our two consultants that are been promoted as panelists this evening to make a presentation to you and then answer your questions and take in any feedback that you have. The project's being led by Lexington Planning. The consultant, Jean Eisberg, is someone you may be quite familiar with. She's worked for the city for a number of years, both in helping us with some of our larger project applications in the processing, as well as developing policies for land use policies and zoning amendments. So she's very familiar with Albany and the commission and the community. With her as partner on this project is Jane Lynn. She is the principal with Urban Field Studios and does a wide variety of architecture and land use planning, and again is assisting us with the preparation of the specific plan. At this point, I think I will turn it over to Jane and Jane for their presentation. They have a PowerPoint presentation for you, and then we all look forward to answering your questions and taking public comment.
Welcome back to you both.
Thank you. Good evening, Chair Pilch and members of the Commission. We're glad to be back. I know it's been a few months, but as you can tell, we've been busy at work with the rest of our team of consultants. So glad to be revealing the draft plan the last couple of weeks and looking forward to your comments. So tonight, I'm going to just give an overview of the plan, the chapters in the plan, and then talk about the next steps and the ways for the public to participate, and then we can have a discussion. This is just a synopsis of the schedule over time. You'll recall that we started this process just at the very beginning of the COVID pandemic in early 2020 and had a series of meetings on land use topics, urban design topics, equity topics. We had a virtual open house last winter with over 400 participants. And then the summer of last year and the fall, we had additionally components on land use, on urban design, and on infrastructure and traffic. And so we're looking to have study sessions this spring and then come back for adoption hearings over the summer. And at that time, we would have the CEQA document for your review, as well as amendments to the general plan and to the zoning ordinance. The vision and objectives for the plan are really rooted in the general plan. And so we've talked about some of the policies and the statements in the general plan about transforming this corridor from an auto-oriented commercial place and commercial uses to a more attractive pedestrian-oriented with mixed-use development. And so, as we've discussed, this vision is in the general plan, but the standards that are in the general plan and the zoning ordinance don't support that type of pedestrian-oriented mixed-use development. And so that's what this plan is really about. And as we've discussed in the past, this plan is focused on housing, and that was the genesis of the SB2 funding and really the gestalt behind the plan. And so you'll see as we talk about the various chapters, much of the work around infrastructure, around mobility improvements, transportation improvements, public realm improvements relate both to the private development, but also to ongoing work that's already being conducted in the city and in the region in terms of transportation improvements. So these are the chapters that are in the plan. There are three really content chapters: land use, urban design, and infrastructure and mobility. Within those content chapters, there's a narrative description of the rationale for the policies, as well as a statement of the guiding principles, or in the case of urban design, the design guidelines, and then the implementing policies or standards, which are really intended as action-oriented policies. So the land use chapter shows proposed zoning and general plan map changes, talks about the outlook for new housing, as well as the changes in commercial related to changing nature of retail, talks about the rationale for the new standards and zoning changes to implement the general plan vision for San Pablo, and then introduces the potential build out, which will be evaluated in the CEQA document. So the framework for the land use is really about enabling mixed use development fronting San Pablo that has ground floor commercial and upper story residential. It also provides a structure for the concept of nodes, which is presented in the general plan, but does not have any specific standards, either in the general plan or the zoning ordinance. the sort of right sizing of standards is intended to create financially feasible development and really provide incentives for getting that type of development based on those base standards. And in that way, that's also contextually appropriate, allows for transitions which are called for in the general plan. And then lastly, to support a range of housing at different income levels, different typologies, to support economic, racial diversity. So just the node concept, the general plan outlines activity centers at 2 nodes, at Solano and at the northern node. This draft specific plan proposes an additional node around UC Village that really has burgeoned since the general plan was adopted. Oops, skipped over a slide. So key policies are revisions to zoning standards, requirements for community amenities. So we're really raising the floor of the base zoning districts. That's the major recommendation of the draft plan. And so in that way, also requiring more community amenities related to affordable housing and sustainability. Also considering an affordable housing fee in lieu of on-site affordable housing. Right now that's identified in the zoning ordinance, but has never been, a fee itself has never been adopted. And then lastly, an idea that we haven't talked about before, which is amortizing the billboards that exist on the corridor to promote redevelopment rather than the passive income. So right now, the specific zoning standards are identified in the specific plan policies. And that's really just temporary for the purposes of transparency and ease of review. But the next time you'd see this, the policies would be simplified, particularly policy LU10, which talks about a number of specific changes to zoning standards. So when we come back, we'll have a redlined package of zoning amendments and a more simplified set of policies. But for now, just for simplicity, it's all in there. And so you'll see in that policy section, there's some big, ugly red text that's telling you this will be taken out later. In terms of general plan amendments, as I mentioned, the specific plan is really rooted in the general plan. And so the vision is set there. But what does need to be amended are the specific standards regarding FAR, height, and number of stories, as well as some general plan map amendments that I'll go through quickly here. And so when this project comes back to you, you'll see the plan, the zoning and general plan amendments, as well as the SEPO documents. So this is a map that we've discussed before. This is the general plan land use map and some call outs for proposed amendments. This is both a base district change between Washington and Solano from high density residential to San Pablo mixed use. And this is based on the location near Solano and the existing context of higher density uses on this block. And then at the UC Village area, creating this node through an additional overlay. And then because we need our general plan and zoning to be consistent, the zoning map shows those similar changes to the overlay districts as well as the base district between Washington and Solano. So I'm going to pass it on to Jane to just quickly walk through the standards and then talk about the next chapter.
Thank you, Jeannie. Good evening, everyone. So the slide that you're looking at right now in the very top, we show the existing zoning. And as you can see across the different zones there's not very much difference right now, and especially on San Pablo Avenue where the SPC zone is limited to 38 feet. So in the second row of elevations here really showing the height as a diagram, we show that there is a proposal for more height, especially along San Pablo Avenue. And what we're showing here is the differences between SPC and R3, which is within that first block between San Pablo Avenue and in the parallel streets, Keynes or Adams. Now they're shown on the very bottom here is a diagram showing the heights as it would apply to through lots. And so this is just very specific for particular lots where the parcels straddle both SPC and R3 or SPC exactly where SPC straddles R3. So there are some different rules there for the heights because of the through lot condition, which is more amenable to the multifamily housing. So this reflects that. And so on this slide, what we're showing are some of the development standards that apply to adjacencies. Now, we know that there's a lot of concern, and we've heard through our feedback about how how the zones are, how the development for these two zones of SBC and R3 are set next to each other. And so these are some of the different ways that adjacent parcels may build up to. So there's setbacks and also upper step backs that are introduced here. There has been in the past a daylight plane, and that has greatly limited the amount of development that is in this area. So you can see where the daylight plane would be as represented by the dashed line. And so to propose something somewhat similar, but is not exactly the same, but to show how there could be a step back of some kind up at the third level and above, that is where there is a step back required so that there could be more space in between the two adjacent zones. And we also do show in the bottom right some other rules that really speak to the parallel streets when SBC is located across the street from R3 or R2. And so that's a special condition as well for the development standards. So that is a summary of some of the things that you see in Chapter 2. In Chapter 3, these are design guidelines, and this whole chapter really looks at the design context and how this would really just apply to new buildings. And what is shown here in guidelines is really to convey design intent. And so we do set through here some site design standards and building design standards, but also include guidelines as well to give context to those standards and in making objective standards. And so the framework of this chapter really is trying to support the transformation of this corridor into a walkable urban environment that is consistent with the general plan. We also wrote in as much as we could to reinforce the sense of place and activity in public life, especially around at the ground floor. And we'll be highlighting some of those elements of the chapter just in a few slides. And then we're outlining with the design guidelines some of the priorities for site and building design so that we can establish the intent for those standards. And so the design guidelines would replace the San Pablo Avenue design guidelines, and they focus on objective standards because those are required for undergoing streamlining review, and that the guidelines would also apply to projects that are not just housing projects along San Pablo Avenue. So these are all to be considered together, although the objective standards really do apply to housing in particular. On the next slide, the design guidelines really address private development and the public realm, and really looks at the site and the block design and all of the access to the site and parking and the way the site is allocated on a horizontal level. And then it also looks at building design and speaks to building massing and form. So the volume of the building, how the ground floor shapes the public realm, and also about the building facade, windows, and adjacencies in the chapter. And so like some of the zoning amendments and general plan amendments, what is shown in the design guidelines chapter is also also marked so that it could be moved into its own separate compendium document. So eventually these design guidelines will live on their own in a separate document so that they can be more easily amended over time rather than having to amend this specific plan. So really they're included right now in the specific plan as a reference, and then they will be moved out in the next iteration. So this is just an example of some of the stuff that's in there, and some of the key guidelines and standards that are in there really have to do with the ground floor and the sidewalk and the public realm along San Pablo Avenue. And so here, this shows some of the sidewalk zones and really speaks to addressing the different zones and the ground floor access and transition between public and private realm. And there are also other standards throughout that go beyond the sidewalk as well, that speak to shared spaces and amenities within the multifamily and mixed use development that is anticipated along San Pablo Avenue. And I think, and here is one of the renderings of what this is envisioned to look like someday as San Pablo Avenue grows up and becomes a little bit more urban, more active, and more walkable. And this is a rendering to show the potential future of what it could be like on San Pablo Avenue.
Okay, great, thank you. So chapter 4 is infrastructure mobility, talks about an analysis of impacts to those utility systems as well as public safety, including the fire. Talks about the implementation of city adopted strategies and plans for ped, bike, and transit improvements, and then incentives to increase travel by walking, biking, and transit in exchange for reduced parking requirements. And so the framework for this chapter talks about those systems, the infrastructure systems, wet utilities, communications, gas and electric, as well as transportation systems. And as required by specific plans and later by the SEQA analysis, this analyzes changes in demand for services as a result of development that could ensue from the specific plan, and identifies necessary improvements to serve that new development and new population. And so the chapter identifies improvements required to serve that new development, and then policies from both some of those existing adopted plan as well as new policies that will provide direction for future investment. So some of the key mobility policies incorporates the completed San Pablo Avenue and Buchanan Complete Streets Plan, the corridor project being undertaken by Alameda County Transportation Commission, which is along the entire San Pablo corridor, including adjacent cities, mobility strategies from the general plan, as well as the active transportation plan. There are also additional standards proposed for bicycles, specifically long-tail bikes and electric bikes. And then lastly, allowances, as I mentioned, for reduced vehicle parking in exchange for amenities for transit, biking, and walking, such as transit passes. A few key policies I wanted to highlight. First, as you may recall, we met in the fall about infrastructure. There are some 4-inch water lines in the planning area that are older pipes that will need to get upsized to serve higher density development. These are already planned by EVMUD. And so part of the policies are having the city work and encourage to get those upgrades underway. Second, to support green stormwater infrastructure and native and climate adaptive landscaping in the planning area. Third, supporting all electric construction, which is based on policies in the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan. And that's for all new buildings and for major renovations. And then lastly, the addition of a fee on new development that would contribute to the cost of new fire department apparatus that helps support fire suppression of these taller buildings that are envisioned by the plan. So our last substantive chapter is implementation, and this is really intended to provide guidance for both the private sector, for property owners, developers, as well as for city staff, decision makers, and the community. And it identifies key implementation steps as well as conditions of approval for sort of types of specific issues that come up, construction noise, construction activity, soils and groundwater, management plans for sites that are on the Cortese list, which means they have potential hazardous materials. So the intention is to address those up front rather than have them be, for example, CEQA issues down the line. So in terms of the guidance for property owners and developers, this chapter explains the entitlement process, the building permit process, and expectations for zoning approval, for the CEQA review, and development fees. And then on the city side, it provides guidance for how to review individual applications for their consistency with the specific plan. And then summarizes the city programs and city policies and ways to monitor success of the specific plan. And so this is just a snapshot of that table, which shows some of the key tasks for the city to undertake, a timeline, whether it's short-term or medium-term, the responsible party, and the detailed action. And then we'll have a series of appendices. Right now, we just have Appendix D and E, which are relevant general plan goals and policies, and financing strategies, which are required of a specific plan. And then the next time around, we'll have a summary of the key zoning standards to just highlight those as a quick reference guide. But of course, people would actually need to go to the zoning ordinance to see the most up-to-date ordinance. But we'll have the red lines for the zoning ordinance and the general plan as appendices in this document. So wrapping up, we did receive a number of public comments today. Those are on the website and they have been provided directly to the Commission. The public comments received so far have addressed a number of topics, including concerns about the increase in height limit, the increase in FAR, concerns about consistency with the general plan, a desire for more affordable housing, some concerns about parking, support for infrastructure improvements, and support for the sustainability measures in the plan and the stormwater measures in the plan. And so I'd refer to those. So this is just an image of the project website, which is shown here, sanpablospecificplan.org. We have a comment box at the bottom of the webpage. And so if people want to put in their name, email address, they can provide a little comment form, any feedback of the draft plan, and of course can also comment to the Commission and the Council. So after tonight, we'll be taking the plan and the Commission's comments and the public comments to date to the City Council for a study session at the end of the month. And then we'll be back to the Commission later this summer with a revised plan, the zoning and general plan amendments, and the CEQA document for the Commission's consideration for recommendation to the Council. And then looking towards City Council adoption hearings later this summer. That concludes my presentation. Happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. And let's start with questions from the commissioners, and then we'll go to the public and then come back for discussion with the Commission. So are there questions from commissioners? And if so, Commissioner Waddy.
Sure, thank you. And thanks to Jean and Jane for a great presentation. I actually have just a very random question for you, but it sort of spurred my thinking on this. So in all of the discussion about going all electric and sustainability, but also talking about the design guidelines, it made me question whether we've thought yet about the need to provide any guidance on things like transformer vaults and where those would be located on San Pablo. And I don't know sort of what Albany's perspective is on sort of undergrounding versus in the building requirements, but I know that often, especially when we're dealing with taller new construction buildings that are going to have a lot of units, when we have zero lot line on San Pablo, it can often lead to dead street frontages. And I know PG&E is requiring more and more space. So just would love to hear your thoughts on whether that is addressed and I just missed it in the plan, or whether that's something we need to be thinking about as part of this.
It's a great point, because we are seeing some of the new buildings proposed and they've got 2 or 3 transformers to serve all electric buildings. So we do have a standard proposed in the design guidelines section that ground level utilities shall be located inside buildings or underground unless prohibited by the utility provider. And I understand that that's a little complex because we can't control what PG&E may allow, but our intention is that any utility should be away from the pedestrian path, clear pedestrian pathway, and ideally out of the sidewalk altogether.
Got it. It may be something that's just worth drilling into in terms of like locating in the buildings. In a lot of my experience, they require direct access from the sidewalk. And so either they would need like a corridor dedicated to get to it elsewhere in the building, or it's just going to end up being on the facade, which is, I don't think anything that, we want ideally. So anyhow, just flagging that to drill in a little bit more given their latest requirements. But otherwise, that was my only question. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Great question. And now we'll go to Commissioner Moment.
Thank you, Jean and Jen, for the great presentation. I have a couple of questions and clarifications. First is about Land Use Policy 10. It allows 68 feet height in on most species-owned lots, and then 85 feet height on the northern node, and also on the species-owned through lots. There are some species-owned lots that front Keynes Avenue also, and Adams. So, like, we have some guideline which allows additional height benefit if they are consolidated. And so if R3 lots are consolidated with SPC's own lot, then R3 lots would get 50 feet height limit. But when two SPC's own lots, back to back are consolidated, then whole lot would get 85 feet height limit, even if they're fronting Keynes Avenue and Adams Street, Keynes and Adams Streets.
That's right, just in that northern node.
But we also rezoned some lots on Keynes Avenue near Solano Avenue node. That's part of our general plan amendment. Right. And so those SPC lots, front Keynes Avenue. And so none of them are through lots. And so by default, they would not get 85 feet height. But then if they are consolidated, then they would get 85 feet height. Is that correct?
No, so right now, the way we've proposed it now is the only opportunity to get 85 feet is in that northern node. So right now in that area between Washington and Solano, where we've proposed a general plan and zoning map change, that would still be a 68-foot height limit.
I see. So I think the language should be clarified, because
we'll clarify that.
This LU10 policy under section 1 SPC height, it says allow up to 85 feet on SPC zone through lots and in the northern node. So, that implies that the lots facing Keynes Avenue near Solano would also get 85 feet height.
That's right. Thank you.
Okay. And then Land Use Policy 11. Let me go to that page. So here we have two required amenity sets. So LU 11.1 says all new development projects are required to, and then it says A, B, C, and it lists those required amenities. And then similarly, item number 2 is specifically about the northern node that exceeds 68 feet height and 4 FAR. But both of these requirements are exactly the same. I was under the impression that because the northern node has higher height limit and higher FAR, the community benefits or required amenities would be, more than the rest of the San Pablo Avenue lots.
So the way it's proposed here is to get that 85 feet or anything over 68 feet at the northern node, you would be required to increase the below market rate from 15% to 20%. So in those lower buildings that are less than 68 feet, it's an either or. So you could do the additional below market rate housing, or you can provide the amenities. And in the 68 and higher feet, it's an and. So you have to provide the additional BMR units. And part of that is, under state law, if we want to increase the affordable housing requirement above 15%, we need to show that it's feasible and provide that report to the Housing and Community Development Department. We haven't proposed to do that here. So the above 68 feet, essentially it's voluntary that you want to go higher. And as a result, you need to provide that additional BMR as a requirement.
No, I'm sorry, I misread it. I missed those ors. It is.
Maybe we'll underline that and too.
Yeah, and then,
yeah, thank you.
Okay, and then in the same policy, we have this requirement of, let me go to that page. Sorry. Okay, so community benefit list A allows publicly accessible open space as part of those required amenities. So I want to know if a publicly accessible open space is provided, would that also be counted towards the required open space?
No, the way we have it structured now, you'd still need to do the on-site common open space or private open space through balconies. So this is in addition to the
This would be
on-site open space.
I see. So I think that also should be, clarified. At least I did not see any specific reference to that required open space is exclusive of required amenity required amenity in form of a publicly accessible open space. And then this might be kind of a minor issue, minor point. Under state density bonus, there would be waivers and concessions, and so a lot of design guidelines would be subject to that. The way you have structured the design guidelines, these are named as SD1, SD2, and BD1, BD2, and then there are subsections under each of them. So when the concessions are requested, would they be requested for SD1 and SD2 as a whole set of guidelines or for individual guidelines?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think we'll need to have better numbering overall as we move forward. Right now, as Jane said, we've got the guidelines and the standards all in here all together for the purposes of kind of sorting it out with all of you and the community. But, the game of housing planning has completely changed, and we're so reliant on objective standards now. So we want to display this a little better going forward. As Jane said, we'll have this compendium document. It'll be adopted separately when you adopt the plan. But I think point taken, it needs to have its own numbering system because you're right. Under state density bonus laws, someone might ask us for waivers from many of these things. We still want to put it out there because this identifies what's important to the city and what we want to see. But you're right. We may end up, I would say someone may ask for, we want to waive bullet 1 and bullet 4 under SD10, something like that.
Right, yeah, okay.
So we'll make that more clear.
Yep, thank you. Thank you.
Your questions are complete. Okay, great. And Commissioner McLeod, please. You're muted.
I was just saying, Commissioner Donaldson had his hand up earlier. I don't want to jump in front of him. Yes, comments or questions first. You okay? All right. Yeah, thank you to our consultants. It's great presentation, a lot of great work here. My first question is about upzoning. So under what we're looking at right now, the only proposal is to upzone that one parcel on Keynes that's next to near Solano Avenue. And that's partly because of its site conditions, its parking lot, it's open, it's a big lot. I guess my question is, why are we not looking at upzoning other parts of Keynes and Adams? And I'm thinking kind of in conjunction with our housing element, where we are considering upzoning across the city, because we should be sharing our housing production across the city. And I'm just wondering why we aren't considering upzoning all of that contiguous area along Keynes and Adams into our SPC zoning corridor, and how that would affect the design guidelines. And what if we come back later and upzone through the housing element? Then what do we do with our Pablo plan? How is that interacting? And I would prefer it to be all done at once. So I would prefer it to work together with the housing element and not be done separately. So coordination would be my goal. So what are your thoughts?
So yeah, great point. So we have proposed to, I would say, upzone everything in the SPC zone. So the entire length of San Pablo, and I mean upzone in the way that we're proposing to increase FARs and heights in the SPC zone. We've proposed to rezone the parcels between Washington and halfway down the block to Solano from R3 to SPC because of the proximity to Solano, the context on that block. We haven't proposed rezonings in other locations, R3 locations, in part because of the desire for transitions that are articulated in the general plan. And so in that way, kind of using the R3 as the transition zone.
Okay, well, maybe we can all talk about that a little bit later in discussion as well. My other question, couple of questions. So the compendium would be our basic design guidelines. And then if we were to modify those in the future, that would be strictly a planning and zoning matter with approval by council. Is that correct?
I think so. I don't know if Jeff wants to weigh in, but yes, that might be adopted by resolution.
Yes, thank you. I agree. The preference would be to adopt the design guidelines by resolution, and it would be the commission preparing those and making a recommendation to the city council, and then the city council adopting them. It just is a little bit easier to format a document as a design guideline that's more user-friendly than writing it as an ordinance, and
Okay.
a little bit more accessible to the ultimate user, hopefully.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. So that's good. And then I had a specific question about vehicle parking. So I was reading the ordinance or the proposal, and I didn't actually see a recommendation or an actual specification. It just says, unless I missed it, said revised vehicular parking and loading standards to allow flexibility, et cetera, et cetera. So is the assumption that it's not changing from our current standard? And I don't know why this is not stated explicitly, giving, an exact number. I mean, are you looking for feedback here for what we should be requiring as a parking standard?
So we have not proposed a reduction in parking from the base standard that exists today, the one parking space per unit. And maybe I think we can word this better, but this is a voluntary way that you could reduce your residential vehicle parking requirement in exchange for providing what's under MOB 1 policy on page 93. So you'd need to provide additional bike parking, transit passes, and then applicants have a couple different ways they can reduce parking. They can already reduce parking through a discretionary process with the Planning Commission. And the idea is cumulatively that you could not reduce the parking more than 50%. That would be half a space per unit without Planning and Zoning Commission approval, which would be a discretionary approval. So you could go as low as 0.5 spaces per unit by providing the transit passes. And
okay, well, yeah, we should be stating it explicitly, whatever it is, and we can argue and discuss what it should be, but it should be very explicit in there, not just vaguely worded. Well, that, I'll have a lot more to say about that later, but that's enough for right now. Thank you.
Okay, and seeing no other hands raised, I will go ahead and ask my questions. Actually, I have some follow-ups from the previous commissioner's questions. In terms of the vaults, that was an excellent question, but I do see that unfortunately, on our sidewalks and on San Pablo and right in front of the city hall, you can see this vaults for perhaps telecommunication equipment or cable TV have been placed in take-up sidewalk width. And is it intended, and so these might be And I think these are added. I'm talking about vaults that were added not in conjunction with any construction, but is the intention of the plan to prohibit adding of any vaults on the sidewalk so that we can keep a clear 11 or 12-foot width to the sidewalk?
That's right.
Any
So,
vaults with
right. So that what the policy and what the standard says in the urban design sections, yes, that everything should be above ground grade. Utilities should either be in closets in a building or underground. But no matter what, it cannot be in that pedestrian pathway.
Okay, great. That is good to hear. And then about the 85-foot height limit, only at the northern node. That's a change, is it not? Because it used to be at all the nodes, correct?
I believe last time we spoke in the fall, we were only at the northern node. We previously had discussed potentially some other locations, you're right, including Solano, and I think that's where that error that Commissioner Momin pointed out on the through lots was still kind of hanging out there. But the last time we spoke, I'm pretty sure we were just talking about the northern node. I see some nodding heads.
Great. All right, thank you. And then the question about the design guidelines being in a separate document, does that mean, do you mean the design guidelines and the objective standards, or only the design guidelines?
Yeah, that's a great question. We intend both, and I think we want to show them a little bit differently so that it's sort of nested, that we don't just have disembodied objective standards, that there's the design guideline, and Jane can talk more about this, but it helps you understand what the intent is behind the standard. We still want to retain some of that in the plan itself, but I think we'll probably have, it'll be both guidelines and standards and clear which is which.
Sure, okay, thank you. And then can you tell me what was your process for designating nodes?
Jane may want to weigh in too, but we started with the general plan, which already identifies the northern node and the Solano node as major activity centers. And then in the zoning ordinance, there's these overlay districts around those two places, but they're not, I would say, objective design standards associated with those nodes. There's general statements about public realm improvements. And so those two nodes were already identified in the general plan. The new node was the UC Village node. And, you may recall, we've talked about a couple different aspects of this. How far should it extend up the block? But UC Village didn't quite exist in its current form when the general plan was adopted. So some of this is that, Sprouts is becoming a destination, and the retail along Monroe, and the idea that you'd have a synergy with what happens across the street. Something we didn't highlight in the presentation, but that's kind of a new idea in the plan, is this idea of potentially repositioning City Hall as a mixed-use development, maybe redeveloping one of the gas stations on the corner. It's in the narrative of the land use chapter. I didn't raise it during the presentation, but that idea that the node could extend all the way to Marin Buchanan to create real place at that intersection. Long-term idea.
Yeah, no, I noticed that. I liked that. Okay, thank you for that. Just a couple more here. There's a discussion about how the advantages of in lieu fees in that they can go directly to produce affordable housing. And I wondered if it was your intention to favor in lieu fees rather than inclusionary zoning, or if you were just it was just part of you were just pointing it out as a matter of discussion.
I think as a starting point, a matter of discussion, they mentioned it's by ordinance, it's in the ordinance that there can be a fee, that a fee has never been adopted. I think one of the considerations is that, of course, developers prefer it. They would rather in lieu fee out and build the market rate housing. Now, that's not the way that I think the city's policy is intended right now. There's a desire to have the units on site. But the point that we discussed in the plan is that there are some benefits of taking the fee and growing that fee and then issuing a notice of funds available, a NOFA. You solicit affordable housing developers to take on those funds, and they tend to be very creative with how they spend them. And then that affordable housing developer, like the project at Cleveland and Washington, is what we call a service enriched building, where there can be supportive services that are provided for those tenants. And so there are real advantages to having a building that's 100% affordable with those support services. And this is a way to get it if you build up that fund.
Okay, thank you for that. We can come back to that in the discussion period. On Solano Avenue, many buildings have no side setbacks. They're built right up against each other. And that might be, it might be that that's grandfathered in, that you couldn't do that. But it did make me think, is there a reason why we have side setbacks on San Pablo? If it's going to be dense development, is there a reason? What would be the reason for having the side setbacks?
I think that what we were showing with the sections that I presented earlier, those are actually the rear setbacks, and there is no side setback requirement. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Oh, okay.
Right, sorry.
My apologies. I thought I could have sworn that there was. Okay,
right.
Thank you.
There's no side setback requirement today or proposed in the SPC zone. It's only when it's next to an R zone site.
Oh,
that there's a daylight plane required today, but actually it's not even necessarily a setback. But we have proposed a setback to the R3.
Got it. Okay. And then one last question. It was mentioned, infrastructure fees were mentioned due to the additional burden of maybe public safety. And do other cities impose such fees?
Well, to clarify, the city's currently engaging in a fee update of its capital, I want to say, capital projects. Is that right, Jeff? Fee. And so as part of that, the intention is that as part of that fee, there may be that would go to fire, there may be an additional fee for fire.
Right. We have on the books today a relatively old capital program fee, I think it's called. And we are updating that. We're looking at all of the departments that have capital facilities. And the fire department in particular, their apparatus and their fire station is one of the most significant capital facility users in the city. So we are asking the consultant to estimate what a fee would be, and then we can have a policy discussion about the merits of that, as well as fees on sewer and stormwater and so on and so forth. Okay,
I would just ask that there be a comparison with neighboring cities to make sure that we're not making development not pencil out because we're charging very high fees. And that doesn't, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I hear you very much on that, and that's a very good point. We will be doing that.
Thank you so much, and thanks for indulging all my questions. It looks like Commissioner McLeod has another question or two. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, sorry. I was looking back at some of the SD guidelines, and I was looking at active frontages in particular, SD 13, and what it's saying there is 50% of each building being inactive. Can you explain that thinking? To me, it seems way low, and I don't really understand, of course there can be garage doors and seeing things like that. But can you go over that? I'm concerned it's really low compared to what I would prefer to see.
Okay, sorry, just could you state the exact policy again?
It's SD 13, and we're talking about active frontages.
Okay. When we were looking at some of these widths of the typical parcels that are along San Pablo Avenue, that, the actual width is often not very wide at all. In fact, somewhere between 50 and 100 feet in width in total. So when we start to say active frontages and we require much more, then it really limits, even the ability to have, say, access through garage and other things. So the 50% is to make sure that you have at least half. And if you think of that, that's at least a 25-foot width. It really is written so that it's appropriate to the size of the typical parcel that is along San Pablo Avenue, and keeping it viable as far as something that could be built. I hope that helped to answer.
Yeah, that makes sense for narrow lots. That does. But at the same time, if you have 100-foot lot or, something much wider, then we're looking at 50% of that, and that's too much, I think. So maybe there's a way to write this so that it applies to a minimum or a narrower width and not to wider widths or something. If there's some cutoff point, if we could do something like that, I think that would be helpful. Okay. The other question I had, it was also, it's kind of getting technical, and I don't know how much we want to go into all that, but 14-foot minimum height for retail, I think that's pretty good. And it's really, or commercial, but it's not recommended to go below that. That's just best design guidelines. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, so the 14-foot clear has to do with leasability. And so with that minimum, and we've run this by our commercial broker before in the past, it's also really commonly found in other, there's other objective design standards that are like, this is consistent with other cities as well. So it's a pretty standard thing to have the commercial have 14-foot clear to have the most flexibility possible for leasing.
Okay. And then live work would be 12, office space would be 12 feet. And I guess regarding live work, do you have examples of live work, recent developments that you could show us? I like the idea in principle, but I'd like to see some successful examples of it. Is there some way? I know there's a project in Berkeley in the planning stage that was having live work at the bottom floor, ground floor, but I don't think it's constructed yet.
Yeah, there are definitely. Yeah.
Go ahead.
There are definitely many examples of live work, and this is a category that is somewhat varied. And what we typically see is that there is some dedicated space along the ground floor frontage. And that's what we're really looking for as that minimum, to make sure that there is at least the space, the vertical space needed for something that is more than residential to happen in that front area.
Okay, and I guess I have two last things. One is the process. So it sounds like you're going to take our feedback, do some revisions, and then take it to council. But I'm kind of concerned that maybe we should see the draft after our feedback is incorporated. I just think it would be better for us to review it once it's gone past this meeting before it goes to council. Is that
So to clarify, we're going to take this current draft with your comments to the council. So we're not going to make any revisions and we're going to go to the council in 2 weeks. So we'll take this draft. And then we'll revise the draft based on your comments, public comments, the council's direction, and come back early summer, May or June, probably.
Okay, so yeah, getting a broader set.
Right.
Okay. And I guess my last question is for staff. There was one letter I received yesterday that didn't get put into the public record from Mr. Johnson that I received yesterday, and I don't understand why it's not in our list of correspondences for this evening. And I would appreciate if it would be put there. I mean, I don't know why it didn't end up there. So that was my last thought.
Thank you. If we missed something that was unintentional, we'll certainly post it right away.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think it should be included. I mean, we got very thoughtful, well-written letters. I really appreciate everyone's time that did that. And he obviously put time and effort into his letter, and I would like it to be part of the package as well. You know, that should be for all of us and for the public to see when it's a meeting like this. So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for noting that, Commissioner McLeod. And for the other commissioners and maybe staff too, we received a PDF file from Nick Peterson, and he indicated there were comments. However, when I tried to look at the comments, I could not identify the comments in the document. Was it just me, or did staff and other commissioners find that they did not find those comments?
I believe those comments they looked like footnotes, and then the facing page had the comment that related to the footnote on the, the footnote on the previous page, if that makes sense.
Right. I guess.
Okay.
Yeah. He didn't get his comments put in the public list either. So I think that's another.
Oh, thank you for that. Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. Yes. I'll go back to Nick Peterson's PDF then. I couldn't quite understand where the comments
I'm sorry.
were.
I see Mr. Peterson's. I didn't see Mr. Johnson's. So sorry.
Okay, thank you for that. And I just want to, thank the consultants one more time and say that it's really fun to see all those, the objective design standards for the first time, and they're quite detailed. And I must say that I didn't, the ones that related to architecture, I didn't study as closely because, so I'm hoping the architects on this commission will have more comments about those. So. If there's no other questions from commissioners, let's go ahead and open it up to the public. 3 minutes each for public comment. And members of the public, please go ahead and raise your hand, and staff, please begin to let them in.
Awesome. So first speaker up, Clay. Clay, you have 3 minutes starting now.
To the commission concerning the specific plan, but I quickly realized there's not much new there and nothing I hadn't commented on before. I do have a couple of quick overall impressions. First, I was struck by the remarkable pivot the specific plan has taken. Initially, the goal of the plan was to implement the vision of a general plan, and we heard this ad nauseum, to transform San Pablo Avenue from an auto-oriented commercial uses to pedestrian-oriented mixed-use developments. But this has now changed. The plan now refers to the transition to higher density housing and maybe mixed-use development. And as described on page 24 of the plan, the main focus of the plan is now on housing. So only about 30% of the San Pablo Avenue corridor is designated for mixed use with required ground for commercial uses. That's quite a change. The other thing that jumped out was a number of times the plan claims that it's addressed the transitions to adjacent existing lower density areas. I counted 9 such claims. As Ed Field points out in his letter, a change from taller buildings on San Pablo Avenue, which are now up to 6 to 8 stories, to the immediately adjacent 1- and 2-story buildings on Keynes and Adams is quote unquote a transition. They all are. However, the proposed mitigation, which is a single 10-foot setback at 38 feet, will not provide, again quoting the general plan, sensitive transitions to lower density development east and west of the avenue. The single setback will not satisfy the land use policy 2.2, which requires, again, quoting the general plan, that we ensure that new developments are designed to minimize sharp contrast in height. It won't satisfy land use policy 3.8, which requires a buffering of residential uses along Keynes and Adams. So the proposal to add 6 and 8-story buildings in San Pablo Avenue will certainly have adversely affect the neighborhoods adjacent to the corridor. The staff knows that the council the staff report notes that the council will have a study session in the draft before sending it back to the commission. So we'll apparently get another bite of this apple. I think it would be appropriate and actually necessary to have the actual proposed amendments, at least to the general plan, before the next meeting. Thanks.
Thank you. And next speaker, please.
Next speaker, Brian Martin. You can go ahead and speak.
Thanks. I appreciate this being on the agenda and having opportunity for people to comment and lots of eyes to look at it and have input. I have things I'm specifically interested in, and there's a lot of different factors here that opportunities for improvement on the street and to avoid problems on the street as things go forward. I do echo many of the concerns that Mr. Larson voiced, and would hope that there would be discussion about mixed use and not on the corridor. I wanted to make sure that there is a transition for properties that go halfway through the block, and 6 stories seems, not sure quite how you do that. It sounds like that really you just don't even try except for that 10-foot setback. So I think lowering the heights there is the better way to go on the halfway through the block. One question I had, maybe it's already been answered, I couldn't really tell, was to get taller developments on San Pablo Avenue, why not set heights lower than desired so that developers can get to the desired heights only by offering low-income housing to qualify for a state density bonus? Why not do that? Let's see, for type 1, Roman numerals 1, 2, 4, 5, 3, 4, those are on one of the pages that in the document with some diagrams of silhouettes of buildings. I don't know what those mean, and I didn't see them defined anywhere. So those types with Roman numerals. So I think it would be good to define those as it impacts neighbors. I do see City Hall Triangle mentioned as a possible development. I think that could be clarified on pages 34 and 39 as to what it means to be repositioning City Hall. I think that word repositioning could be clarified. And I did want to make sure that I do actually agree with, I think the properties north on the north end of San Pablo Avenue are well buffered, like around the bowling alley from neighbors. So higher heights, I think, are better there, but they do also impact the neighbors with the parking and traffic. And so that's why the housing element I mentioned needs to spread things out more and not try to get squeeze every little drop out of the neighbors on Adams and Haynes. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Next speaker, Ed Fields. Ed, you have 3 minutes to speak. Go ahead.
Good evening. I wanted to just address a couple of the points that I wrote about. There have been several questions about mixed use, and I guess Commissioner McLeod was concerned about active spaces and how much there needs to be. I would like to get a very clear, explicit answer of where mixed use on the ground floor of San Pablo Avenue is required. And then the assumption would be everywhere else it isn't required. Something else might be. When I say mixed use, I guess I meant commercial. So where ground floor commercial is required on San Pablo Avenue. The other question that I wanted to address, or have you address, is this in lieu fee, which we keep hearing has never been adopted. In my copy of the zoning code, there's an in lieu fee. And a dollar amount has never been set for it because the dollar amount is set at the time, I don't know if it's a building permit or, when the application is processed, And the fee needs to be assessed because for smaller developments, it is assessed on fractional units. And then at a certain number of units, then we round up. And I'm concerned that this is an attempt to change that in lieu fee. And nothing has been written about it, how it might be changed. So it's just, you're just going with this draft report that says, well, maybe we should consider it, allowing it instead of building the inclusionary housing. And we've never had an in lieu fee. So what does that mean? We'll come up with one when we feel like it. The in lieu fee that I'm aware of is very clear. It's the difference between the cost of a market rate unit and, say, for example, in the case of a sale unit, using the low or very low income for the family size. And I don't know whether it's 30% of your income is supposed to be attributed to housing, and that includes insurance and taxes. And then you put down a mortgage, 20%, and you come up with what that person can afford in terms of a purchase price. And I mean, I'm concerned that there may be an attempt to reduce that because it's just been very vague why we're talking about not just whether or not you should have an in lieu fee instead of inclusionary housing, but what it might be. So thank you.
Thank you. And I don't see any more hands for public comments. Are there any last, I do see one more hand.
Nick Peterson, you have 3 minutes to speak. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Nick Peterson. I'm a member of the Albany Climate Action Coalition and Albany for Everyone, and have a strong interest in environmental housing and more affordable housing in Albany. So I did submit comments to the Planning Commission. Sorry, they were, there were a markup on the PDF, and they do have it doesn't come out very well on what I provided, but I want to give a little clarification on a couple of them. First of all, I really appreciated this process that staff has gone through, and I just wanted to say, and I appreciate the efforts of the consultant and of all people that have participated in the public comment too. I think it has made the plan overall a better plan, and I'm excited to see this come to its final stages and hopefully will be approved. One concern I had was I still think the bike parking, maybe I misunderstood it, but the amounts that are being required just seem too light, especially if parking is going to be minimized. I would recommend having at least one bike space per bedroom, and in studios, at least one bike space per studio. Plus, also every unit should have a space for a cargo bike. So that was kind of my recommendation. I'd also like to expand on what the prior caller said about the in lieu fee. I don't know if we have to have this, but I'm really worried that, having inclusionary housing is really important, and the motivation should be to provide that, not to just buy out of it. And if they buy out of it, what's going to happen? Is that going to actually help Albany create more affordable housing somewhere, or is it just go into a fund and maybe we do some city improvements, but we don't get any affordable housing? So that's a real concern I have with that. And I think it needs to be more clearly defined. And I think it needs to be a counter incentive to, it should really cost people to buy out of doing inclusionary housing. We really want the affordability to come into play, and this should encourage that. I guess it's the challenge is to balance that against what the state bonus law will allow developers to do. And that's a real fine edge, I guess, to walk, and maybe some more explanation on that would certainly be good from the consultant. The other thing I think I did make a comment about having a little bit more of a setback between at the transition zone, I can't remember if it was just 15 feet, but that seemed to, at the 38-foot level, that just seemed a little narrow, and maybe even an additional 5 feet would help out. So those were my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, and now I do not see any more hands from the public. Going once, twice. Okay, back to the commission. We'll close public comment and back here for discussion. And if I may, what I'd like to do first is ask if the staff could discuss some of the questions that came up from the public comment. I heard some questions about where mixed use is, questions about the in lieu fee, and then some particular detailed questions from Brian Martin. So would staff and or consultants address those, please?
I think we can trade off here a little bit. I'm happy to address the in lieu fee questions. So the city's inclusionary housing ordinance, as it was adopted, I think back in maybe 2004 and 2005, does allow for the city to collect an in lieu fee instead of requiring the units be built on site. We've never implemented that provision. We've never applied that, I should say. We've never applied that provision. We did do an in lieu fee study probably about 5 or 6 years ago. And we could, if we wanted to, have the conclusion of that study incorporated into the city's master fee schedule. So it'd be very transparent what it is. And we could make adjustments for current market conditions, but that's not a difficult thing to do. I think staff has generally agreed with one of the commenters that where we can get units in a project that's desirable, where we have an obligation to try to create those units. But we also realize that if we have an opportunity to do affordable housing elsewhere in the city does need to bring money to the table to help create those units and provide the services. And in order to do that, we have to have money. Right now, we don't have any money that's dedicated to affordable housing. So there's a policy trade-off there that we could deal with on a case-by-case basis. Last but not least, I'll just mention that it's a different decision for rental housing versus ownership housing. I think for rental housing, it makes a lot more sense, a lot easier to implement an on-site affordable housing inclusionary unit. For ownership housing, like a condominium, that's a much more complex situation, and it raises a host of issues as ownership transitions and as income of an owner transitions over time. So at staff level, at least, I'd be more open to exploring this for future projects, but it's ultimately a policy decision for the city decision makers to make.
Sure, and we can discuss that. But just a clarification: when you say you've never applied it, does that mean no one has ever applied for it, or it's never come up, or what do you mean by that?
It comes up, and generally our response has been, at the staff level at least, you're welcome to ask for that if you want. That staff would not recommend doing that for the projects in the recent past, and that's usually been enough for developers to go ahead and just say they'll incorporate it into the project. And until we've had this recent, the Cleveland and Washington project, the Saha project, we could collect this money, but we didn't have a way to spend it, and that's another consideration. We don't want to just collect money and have it sit there and miss the opportunity to create the units on site.
Okay, and in terms of the mixed use, my understanding is the mixed use is only required at the nodes and encouraged elsewhere. Is that a fair short summary?
No, and I think we need to make that more explicit. You know, we had presented that idea this fall, and frankly, it was rejected. So we're proposing ground floor commercial would be required everywhere. I think what the plan was trying to do was explicitly say it's really required at the nodes, and it's in the list of community benefits as sort of a belt and suspenders. Like, okay, if you try to waive out of it under state density bonus law, it's still on the subjective list of community amenities, and we encourage you to choose it as one. So right now, it's required everywhere as it is today. And one exception is that there's a policy that says housing element sites could not have commercial above the ground floor. And so that means you wouldn't have, you could conceivably have less commercial space.
And live work counts as commercial?
I'd have to look at that and see how the zoning looks at that today.
Okay, I think we intended that, but my other commissioners can correct me if I'm wrong. So, yeah, let's make sure we look at that. And then Brian Martin had some questions, specific questions about Roman numerals and such. I don't know if you caught all that.
Yeah, I can answer that. That refers to the construction type, and apologies for not putting a note in there. We will do that. The construction type, type 5/1 is a wood construction type. Type 3 is another kind of construction type. And what we're just trying to say is the typical, we will either strike it because it may either just be too much detail, or we will explain in our next iteration and put more information in there.
Okay, and those are the main questions that I heard from the public. Did staff or consultants hear any others that they wanted to address right now before we go to discussion? Not seeing any head nods, so let's go to commission discussion, and we have one hand up so far. Commissioner Waddy.
Thank you, Chair Pilch. I was just going to comment on those two items that were also just discussed, just to add a little bit of my perspective on it as well. So first, food for thought, I think the confusion with the mixed use requirement for commercial on the ground floor comes on page 39, item 5 on the bullet, where it specifically just says commercial is required at the nodes. So I think inherently that statement makes one think that elsewhere it's not required other than at large scale retail. So we might just want to clarify that bullet on follow-up. In terms of the in lieu fee too, I mean, just my thoughts on this in general is that especially for ownership condo buildings, I think the important thing to keep in mind is ownership condo buildings typically have a homeowners association fee. And so when you have on-site inclusionary units, they often are not able to afford the HOA fee. And so although they might be able to buy the unit at the, below market rate or the inclusionary rate, they then get stuck with this annual HOA fee that can't be factored into the purchase price. And then they're stuck and basically can't afford, a $400,000, $600,000, $800,000 HOA fee that's required monthly. And so I think that's where an in lieu fee comes in with ownership units, where you just don't have to deal with that HOA fee issue of a low income person not being able to afford that, even if they could afford the base unit. So I think that's where it's really helpful. I think the other thing where it's really helpful to have an inclusionary fee available is that those dollars can get leveraged against other dollars, against tax credits. And so the dollar stretches farther when you have, 100% or 80% affordable housing projects in general. So it's just, it's a trade-off, right, of not being able to have mixed income projects, but your dollar does stretch farther, being able to leverage it against either state or federal dollars. So I think those are just two important. It doesn't mean it always works. And I would agree that I think there are a lot of project typologies in Albany where we would rather have them on site. But I do think it's just an important thing for us to all be aware of, especially in this plan where we're going to anticipate seeing higher densities, that those may become more of realities. So anyhow, those are just my 2 points on it. But otherwise, I don't have any additional commentary. I feel like this is evolving in a really positive way, and we just need to start sort of honing in on some of the devils in the details. And I'm sure every round that we review it, we'll pick up on a couple little things here and there. But those were just the only follow-up comments, especially in response to some of the public commentary tonight. Thanks.
Sure, and just a note for staff, it looks like we still have one member of the public in the panelist list, so just to prevent unwanted noise, we need to move that person. Thank you. And next up is Commissioner Donaldson. Please go ahead.
Sure, thanks. Okay, I guess I want to start out there. My main comment tonight, or maybe not my main, I think so, is a process-oriented one. I read the specific plan law, and established in Government Code 65450. The purpose of a general plan is to provide for the systematic implementation of the general plan, basically, or a part of the area of the general plan. And when I've dealt with them in the past, that's what they've done. And Section 465-454 says that no specific plan may be adopted unless the proposed plan is consistent with the general plan. The general plan has to derive. This plan, if it is going to be a specific plan, if we are going to be it can't be a specific plan, I don't think, because it is not consistent with the Albany 2035 general plan. I don't think we can adopt it as a specific plan. It contains, in fact, policies and proposals that directly contradict, in my opinion, our general plan. Examples: policy LU 3.1. The general plan clearly limits the FAR on San Pablo to 3.0, but this plan calls for much higher FARs. Policy 3.8 requires buffering, including daylight planes, but this plan eliminates the daylight plane regulations and substitutes something else for them. I don't think you can do that. The policy LU 3.9 calls for additional office space on commercial land, but the specific plan, the draft specific plan, reduces commercial space along San Pablo Avenue. And I was chair of this commission when we updated the general plan in 2016. And I can tell you that those policies are not incidental fluff. They were really carefully developed and seriously debated at length, especially the 3.0 FAR, and especially the daylight plane regulations. And they just can't be overturned by adopting a specific plan. We'll say, hey, you can't do that. So that's a real thing. And you can't change the general plan map. And this is proposed to change the general plan map. You can't do that with a specific plan. I don't think you can add a node either. We had 2 nodes in the general plan we adopted, and this plan wants to add a 3rd node. I don't think you can do that without first amending the general plan. So the process is to me, that's a real serious process problem here, and that it's a fatal flaw, in fact, if you're going to call this a specific plan. And it needs to start over with a general plan update. We need to have the community have a general plan update and discuss about whether you want to have these kinds of radical changes in our general plan as they affect San Pablo Avenue. This is sort of an end run around the general plan, and I don't think it's legal to do it with a specific plan. The state can override our general plan. We can't do a specific plan to override our general plan, in my opinion. The state does it all the time. The state has the density bonuses. They require ADUs, SB 9, SB 10, all of those things. They can override our general plan, but we can't draft a little plan along San Pablo Avenue and say, oh, this overrides the general plan policies. So, this may be a very well done report. It is a very handsome report. It's very well written. It's well thought out. There's a lot in here I like. I like some of the initial approach to the objective standards. I like a lot of the design guidelines for new development along San Pablo Avenue. There's a lot to like. But I want to note that we got the Albany Bowl development approved, a nice, fancy, modern, new development, and we got it done without the specific plan. It was a state density bonus law that allowed that project to get as large and to have the configuration it had. At the beginning of this whole process, I said, I'm not sure we need to do this plan. I think all we need to do is raise the height limit along San Pablo Avenue and see what happens. We're going to get a lot more development. It'll be density bonus focused development, and that's what we're going to have. And I think that's that I still think that's the way to go. That would be the good way to go. So anyway, that's my general comment. And I do have a number of tabs in my copy of the report. I'm not sure how many of, if they're too detailed, how many of these to go through. I might just try to glance through some of them so as to not take up more time. Yeah, on page 3, it says this is a 20-year horizon for this plan. And I think I'd forgotten about that, and I wonder why and what's the purpose of having that? Why do you want to go do that? It exceeds the general plan by 5 years, the horizon in the general plan by 5 years. So maybe I don't have too many things here. Again, I had concerns about the land use map. I don't think we can change the general plan land use map in a specific plan. I don't think that's legal to do. On page 23, just a clarification. I think in the second paragraph, it need to have affordable units. It's not projects with 10 or more units must provide half of the required affordable units to low-income houses. It's a minor thing, type of thing. On page 38, it's real clear that this plan calls for increasing the floor area ratio and eliminating the daylight plane. And as I said before, I don't think it can do that. Adding a node, I don't think you can do that. And that's on page 32. That's not a comment. I think policy LU3, calling for general plan amendments, can't be a part of a specific plan. You can't do it. And the same with policy LU6. We're just talking about prohibiting new commercial development above the ground floor. Oh no, we haven't talked about that. New commercial development above the ground floor. I think that goes against a general plan policy LU 3.9. And you'd have to amend the general plan before you'd be able to do that. Let's see. Yeah. That is, the setback, the daylight plane provisions I mentioned already. On page 51, the objective standards are highlighted in blue or bolded in blue, and I'm wondering why number 5 was not. I need some clarification, I guess, in as you go moving forward about who decides what is the objective standard and what isn't. I mean, the way I read it, it looks like number 5 could be an objective standard, but I don't know why it isn't, and maybe some thought and insights into your decision making on that. What objective standards apply and what ones are sort of just recommendations. There are a lot of the good design standards I thought were well done in here. Okay. On page 70, there's B4 and B5, and I guess my question was that had to do with the modifications in the fenestration or in the articulation of the buildings along the street, and I'm wondering if these are choices or or you do one or the other, not both. It doesn't look like. I think that should be clarified. And that's on page 70. And then I think on utilities, I have a wondering why. I think we need to address cell phone utilities here. I mentioned that at the last hearing when we had talked about utilities. We have at least two, maybe three. I know three cell phone towers along San Pablo in the city. And if there's any development near those, that's going to affect them. And they might have to be relocated. I don't know what's involved in that, but I think that I'd like to know more. I think the public should know more about any influences on utilities, on cell phone towers, if there's building on that site or immediately adjacent to that site, and how can the city work with those service providers? Do they go on top of the new buildings? Is that an issue? Do they get raised? I don't know. I think we should talk about cell phone utilities in the utilities section and do some more research on that to figure out how their presence could affect development along San Pablo. And then finally, of course, my big issue in the past, you've heard me talk about this, parking, some of the parking issues. I totally do not favor unbundled parking. Parking should be bundled. I think we should require it. There's been a lot of stuff going around about Donald Shoup's reports and the high cost of free parking. I read his books. I'm familiar with that. They're of limited application in Albany, in my opinion. We have very few developments that were built with huge parking lots around them and wasting land in that way. And what we're going to see with unbundled parking is that those tenants are going to park on the street where it's free because Albany provides parking on the street. And we shouldn't allow that. We should have one space per unit. I'm okay with the reductions that the consultants have put in here for bike parking, transit passes, and all of that to reduce that requirement. But cars are not going to go away. I am sorry to say, I really believe that. They'll be electrifying, but they're not going to disappear. And if we're not careful, we're going to overwhelm the parking availability on our streets within hundreds of feet of San Pablo Avenue if it's developed the way that we're talking about. Unbundled parking means you just provide free parking at city expense for those tenants. And then they don't use the garages. The parking spaces don't rent out. And then we have a policy in here that says, oh, if you're not renting out all your parking, then you can apply to the city to convert it to other purposes. And that's exactly what would happen. That's policy 4 on page 93. I just think this is just wrong, all wrong, and that we need to really pay a lot more attention to parking. And if we're going to preserve the quality of life in Albany, I just don't want to see it get overwhelmed with cars like the Marina District in San Francisco or some of the other neighborhoods that we know about, that's where parking is just so difficult to find. And those are my comments, I think. Yep.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Donaldson. You had a number of questions, which I thought were good ones. And one of them, let's see, was about the general plan. But my understanding was that the general plan can be amended at any time, and that it was our intention of amending the general plan in conjunction with the creation of the specific plan. Did staff want to say any more about that?
Thank you, Chair Belch. Yes, so that is exactly our intention, to sequentially to develop this plan in draft form, figure out what general plan amendments would be needed. We do think that overall the themes in the current general plan, the goals and objectives are being achieved. But yes, there are some of the zoning type of parameters like FARs and heights and so forth that are referenced in the general plan that clearly need to be amended. So once the draft plan is completed, we can finalize the changes to the general plan. And our notion is to do it sequentially. We've heard this comment from Commissioner Donaldson, from Mr. Larson in particular, in some of his public comments over the years. Looked into it carefully. I'm not aware of any statute or case law that requires a pause between adopting general plan amendments and adopting zoning ordinance amendments, which is essentially what the specific plan will ultimately be. We feel like it is legally appropriate to do it this way. It's in many senses the kind of the same thing we do with CEQA documents. We'll adopt an environmental impact report, and then that same meeting or maybe the following meeting will adopt the project approvals. They're developed in tandem. And I just mentioned that the general plan, although it's a relatively new document, there's a lot changing in the world these days, in the land use planning world, with state laws, with the obligations that are being driven by the housing element process. Whether we like it or not, we're amending the general plan because of the housing element. Exactly how that plays out, of course, we have to finish the housing element, but there will be amendments. And then for that matter, the housing element itself is an amendment to the general plan. And economic conditions, social conditions, and I think community awareness about segregation, racial justice types of things also are all driving the need to do a general plan amendment one way or the other. So again, our thought is to do this as a package. And if there's some case law or some statutes that we're not aware of, happy to hear about that. We would certainly comply with it. But our understanding and our practice that we've seen in other cities is that these are done as a package.
Okay, thank you for that. And then there was a question about the 20-year horizon, I think. I don't recall that for the document, but I don't know if consultants or staff want to weigh in on that.
So as indicated, the general plan horizon is 2035, which, there's in one regard, we could take more of a 15, 13-year plan for this. Part of it is that, you recall the traffic analysis that we updated, that model does look at a 20-year horizon. So that was helpful looking at cumulative projects. But it's just that this may take a generation for the plan to build out. It's unlikely that we're going to see a lot of development, the whole corridor transform over an 8 to 10 year period. I mean, it's going to take beyond 20 years. So some of it's just sort of giving a little bit of room for the plan to get put into place and some catalyst projects to happen, including potentially, the bulk projects that's already been approved, so that people can see what that's like, and the rental market kind of sort itself out, and other property owners may choose to make changes to their project. So some of it's just allowing that room to breathe for the plan.
Okay, makes sense. And then the question about the which are design guidelines and which are the why am I spacing on the name? Help me here, please. The
guidelines versus the standards.
Thank you. Yeah, the objective standards. So my understanding, I think you've already answered this, is that they're now mixed together, but you said that the objective standards were bolded, but your intention is to tease them apart for clarity in the future or the next time. Did I get that right?
Well, they are currently, as was mentioned, the bolded ones are objective standards, and the ones that are not bolded are more like context, or I thought that the suggestion that the recommendations, that was actually pretty accurate. So the bolded ones are the ones that are absolute, and then the other ones are not. So it's really good to hear this kind of feedback, because some of them teeter on the edge between whether or not they are something that is absolutely required or something that is suggested. So it is helpful to hear whether or not there is an opinion on either direction for any particular standard or guideline. So that is very helpful to us.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't have any comments in particular about the individual items or the details. I noted that it said that they were bolded, but I believe what you mean is they were bolded in blue as well. They're both bolded and blue, correct? Okay. You might want to state that because there's bold text as well as bold in black and bold text in blue. So it wasn't quite clear to me. That's the one of the clarifications I was looking for. And then I assume you got the comments about page 70. It sounded like just some clarifications on some text. And we have a cell phone ordinance. I assume that we're going to be, staff will deal with the implications on the cell phone ordinance and whether or not we have to deal with that in the specific plan. And then one final question that came up from those remarks is, but correct me if I'm wrong on that. And then one final thing that came up for me was, I believe parking management is mentioned in the general plan that we will consider or looking at parking management for the city. Is that correct?
I'd have to go back and see exactly what the general plan says about that. I think there is some reference to it, and whether it's in there or not, that would be our intention, is to revisit the parking issues over time. And if we do get to the point where a paid parking or residential parking permit program seems as though it will be viable, I think the city should consider that. The last time we looked at this 4 or 5 years ago, we just weren't at that threshold of parking demand.
Okay. All right, great. And then I didn't see any more Commissioner hands up for comments. Anyone else? Oh, Commissioner McLeod.
Yeah, thanks. Since this is our only forum for actually giving feedback on this document, I think it's important to be pretty specific and to go through it pretty carefully. I mean, my ideal way of dealing with this would be to provide written comments, but since that's not really the forum that we're allowed to work with. Yeah, so just kind of looking at big picture to start off, I just really support this process, and I support the goals, and I support the direction it's heading. And I think we really want to be working with our housing element and coordinating these two things really well. And part of that coordination is not relying on state density bonus law to hit our housing element targets. So one commenter said, asked why we don't just use state density bonus law. And the answer is that we can't count those potential units in our housing element, and we need to count those units in our housing element to hit our targets. So that's one big thing. And then, one other consideration that we have to keep in the back of our minds is that the state density bonus law may go away. And then where are we? Then we're stuck with our current standards or minimal standards, and we're basically back to square one and having to redo this process all over again. So I think we should be setting higher standards now, and state density bonus law will play out one way or another in the future. It might not be there in 10 years. It might not be there in 5 years. It could go away by ballot initiative, potentially. So I don't think we should be counting on state density bonus law. And I think we should be doing objective standards that meet what we want to do in Albany without depending on that. So that's the reasoning I use not to count on state density bonus law, even though we can count units that are built under state density bonus law to fulfilling our housing element, but we can't plan on them as part of our housing element plan to be approved by the state. So I think that's really important to remember. And then I'm confident that it makes sense to define this plan, and then that gives us the exact things we need to do to go to the general plan and change. So it makes a lot of sense to do this first. In fact, we have to do this first. Otherwise, we were sort of shooting in the dark when we go to look at our general plan. So I don't think the relationship is skewed. I don't think the process is skewed. I think the process is proceeding as it should. So other things, you know, it takes a lot of time to read these plans. It takes a lot of time to look at each item. You know, I support the land use ideas. The one thing I would consider, you know, and it's kind of hand in glove with the housing element, is actually upzoning the rest of Keynes and Adams that are contiguous, that are within our plan boundary. You know, we're talking a lot about transitions, and the way you deal with transitions in zoning is that you raise one area and you raise the adjacent area up another amount to provide a new level of transition when things change as things grow. And that's how cities grow. Areas don't just go boom straight up. They kind of go up and taper, and you know, that tapering kind of spreads out from the main street. And you know, going up higher on San Pablo is entirely appropriate, and I don't see why we don't extend a little bit of that either through R3 or incorporating those R3 zones that are contiguous into our SC or San Pablo commercial zone to allow more lot consolidation and allow better projects throughout that area. So I mean, I would seriously consider or suggest that we do that. Not just that one lot, even though that one lot, I can see why we would upzone it, because it's basically a big open area with lots of room to put new buildings without a lot of other things in its way. Regarding affordable housing, you know, the in lieu fee, I am not a big fan of. I think it should be pretty high or really high. I think it's better to spread out affordable units around the community instead of clumping them all in one little space. You know, socially, I think it's better. I mean, there's ways we could critique the whole way we do affordable housing in this country, but this is the mechanism we've got at the moment. And I think, you know, trying to incorporate these units across the city, it's a better approach. And I would, you know, suggest that if we have an in lieu fee, that it should be pretty high. Right? I think it should be you know, not attractive, not an easy way out, absolutely not. And then, you know, it does ask the question of what we do with the money. And it sounds like there are ways we can do things with that money, but I also wonder how much could we generate? I don't know if there's any estimate of how much we could generate if that's the way we went. I would be interested to know, is it millions of dollars? Is it just hundreds of thousands? Is it, you know, if it's just in the hundreds of thousands, it's not going to go very far. If it's in the $10 million, I mean, I don't know what kind of fees these could generate, but, you know, if it's in the $5 million range, yes, maybe then we could do something that would be significant. You know, if it's only a few developers that opt in, I don't know if it's going to really give us much money at all. So let's see, getting into other things, I support 65 or 68 feet. I think it's important to have 68 feet along the whole corridor. I think that's great. And I support 85 at the, what we are calling nodes, even though I guess I think of it as activity nodes and not as nodes in the classic sense of intersections and pathways that intersect and things like that. And I would, well, I'm not sure exactly where the line for a half mile from the BART station is, but I would say 85 feet within a half mile of BART is certainly appropriate, in line with, you know, urban guidelines for major transit stops and all that, and accessibility. I support the setbacks versus daylight plane. I think that's a good idea. Allows the buildings to go up a little higher. I mean, it allows more units. I mean, what we're trying to do is facilitate housing production. So anything like that, the daylight plane, if it's limiting our housing production, then we should modify it and basically get rid of it. Kind of similar in the idea of FAR, I support the higher FAR. I am not sure exactly why we have a 4.0. I'm not an expert enough in it to know why 4.0 is better than 3.5 or why 4.5 isn't better than 4.0. So how did we get exactly to 4.0? But I think it's better to have it higher. Again, FAR is an impediment or an obstacle to creating more housing units, so therefore we need to raise it. Let's see. I definitely support commercial along all the corridor, with the exception of 100% affordable housing projects. Like consultants say, it's not going to come all at once. We're not going to get a complete build out. And I think there's plenty of time for new commercial spaces to be absorbed as these projects come along and are built. We are talking about at least probably a 5-year lag before we get our first project under this plan. That's what was happening in El Cerrito. It took them 5 years before they really got any serious projects going. So we have that lag, and then we have, 15 years after that to get these things built out, and they don't all happen at once. And so I think there's plenty of time for commercial space to be absorbed in the community, and I think it creates a better urban street to have commercial, or commercial and active uses, but absolutely no parking lots, no, we don't want dead zones, basically. And I understand the idea of the nodes, and I could see the UC area having its own kind of energy, especially as we get more grad student housing. There could be more students over there. There would be more customers spending more time on the street. I know they love takeout food, so, it would provide, more business for our community. So I think that's a great idea. There's some things a little bit problematic about the language of requiring, significant architectural features. It seemed a little vague to me in the nodes, but I think at the node at Solano and San Pablo, then I think it's the corner treatments that become critical. The corners, how the corners are dealt with at each of those buildings. So I think language, something about how the corners need to be prominent or architecturally significant would be important, especially at Solano. Because for me, that is kind of the definition of a node where streets intersect and, people coming and going from lots of directions. But I do kind of understand the node of activity idea for the other ends of Albany. And let's see. Guiding principles, yes, I agree with those. I don't think we really have much in the way of sustainability in terms of actual building performance. One letter writer wrote about that. I think it's important, either LEED or something, or some higher standard than what we've got now. We have a lot more to deal with in terms of smoke days and, that kind of health. So there is a lot to consider there. Design guidelines. I had some questions. Let's see. It was, okay, well, I'm sorry, page 50, where am I? Oh, I wanted to go back to page 50. Guiding principles. I think there's one that's really missing here. And, you have building types, and then number 2 is convenient walkable community. And I would suggest that we have a 2A and a 2B, and 2B would be convenient bikeable community. I mean, a big part of what we are doing is trying to provide alternatives to car use, trying to create mode shift, and creating a convenient bikeable community is a big part of that. Reducing traffic, reducing vehicle miles traveled. I really think that deserves more attention. I mean, a lot more attention. And I just as an aside, I listened in on an AC or an Alameda County Transportation Commission meeting about a week ago, and they're proceeding with a plan for protected cycling lanes, in Oakland, Emeryville, and Southern Berkeley. And the plan is to extend that to all, Northern Berkeley, Albany, in 3 to 5 years in the planning stage. So it is coming. And I think the idea is that we give people alternatives to driving, and that coincides with bike parking requirements, which I'll get to in a little bit. Open space, I think open space at 100 feet is per unit is okay. I think it's still a little higher than El Cerrito and Berkeley from what I remember reading, which were about at 80 feet, but I think 100 feet's fine. And I like the idea of the outdoor space being an alternative, good alternative to that. Let's see. The nodes, I think I'm okay in the sense of having them as activity nodes. Let me see, there was some other, I mentioned SD 13 before. And I think, right, we just talked about, I think it should be better defined for, in terms of the minimums and not allowing a really, really big, long project to get away with only 50% active use somehow. So, and then, let's see, I'm fine with the 14-foot height minimum. I think that's good. I think it still allows at 68 feet for 5 residential floors above the commercial space. So that would be my goal, be to allow actual 5 floors above. So I think that's good. Let's see, the commercial entrances, that's fine. Yeah, I like the storefront diagram with the heights. I think that's good. Right, and we want to minimize curb cuts on San Pablo, and I would think that if we have a corner lot, it would be good to have the parking entrance accessed from the perpendicular street versus San Pablo. I know some residents were concerned earlier about that would create more flow through the neighborhoods, but I think it's much better in terms of the urban street not to have it crossed on those driveways a lot by cars, especially if it's a pedestrian environment or a cycling throughway that we can, connect with through Berkeley to Oakland. So minimizing that and having some, I don't think I saw anything about having parking on the side or a parking entrance on the side street, but maybe that could be added or noted. Let's see, there was something about hidden utilities, and I would just note that if we go all electric, we won't have gas meters to worry about. So that's another aesthetic benefit of all electric. And aside from all the environmental benefits. Let's see, bicycle parking. Yeah, I think it's really important to have this clear pathway note that, we had one project, Berkeley Bowl project, where they had some designated parking spaces behind a parking space, which kind of begs credulity. So it's really important to have that. And that's a beautiful picture in the brochure with that gorgeous bike space there that, if they could all be like that, that would be great. But I think they're all going to be a lot tighter and a lot more crowded. And I had a question about SD28 parking garage design. We're not really envisioning having is that for standalone parking garages? I couldn't quite figure that out. It says parking garage design. I don't think it means that we're going to have any. I would not want any parking garages or parking structures on San Pablo Avenue. So I don't know.
Are you asking for clarification now, or?
No, I'll just let this comment stand. I think it's okay. Building massing. Let's see, and then BD4. There must be some logic to the diagrams you presented. I don't know if they make sense in all cases, and I don't know if 2 feet deep makes sense in all cases, or As far as a recess goes, I mean, you can do a lot with 1 foot. You know, if it's in conjunction with material changes, it could be fine. I don't know. I just, I mean, I get the idea of breaking up the massing a bit, but I don't know why those exact numbers. It's just hard for me to, you know, agree or disagree. But I mean, I agree with the idea of breaking up the massing, but I don't know why 40 feet or the other mid block or the mid block break. But anyway, as far as facade composition, I think that's good language. It's not prescriptive so much, but I think it gives enough room for interpretation for the developers and architects to come up with good design without being overly prescriptive. So, you know, I don't know. I mean, you could argue with some of that line, that language and design terms, but you know, overall, I think it's probably fine. Facades. Yeah, I think window relief is important. We don't want just a flat window if it is kind of standalone windows versus planar windows. I think that's part of the problem with the 2 housing projects we have on San Pablo now. The windows don't look good at all. So I think that put a lot of people off back when they were first done and led to some backlash, which is sort of why we were in the low height mess to begin with. I'm sorry this is taking some time, but it's our only chance to talk about these things. So, and in terms of, you know, infrastructure, the only thing I would add to that, I think it's all good, but when EB Mud is digging up the street, I think we mentioned this before, they should put the purple recycled water pipes in the trenches, even if it's not connected, but maybe someday it could be connected. So I think if we at least get the pipes there, it would be great. Let's see. You know, I think bike planning, I think well, there's a couple of things with bike infrastructure planning. Our active transportation plan is woefully out of date. It needs to be redone. I think it is going to be redone. So that is and ACTC is obviously working on San Pablo. So those 2 things are coming, and it means that our previous San Pablo Avenue complete streets plan, it's basically totally out of date. So I don't think we should even be referring to that anymore. It's 10 years old almost. Things have changed dramatically. I don't think it's relevant to this project anymore. I think what's relevant is the ACTC planning process and our new active transportation plan that's coming. So I think we should be looking to those, you know, for street level changes. And then for vehicle parking standards, this is where I have a big issue. I really disagree with I just 100% disagree with the 1 space per unit policy. I think that should have been stated explicitly so we can at least know it's there. But I 100% disagree with that. You know, I really think we should, and I've never advocated for 0 parking. Some letter writers have said the commissioners have advocated for 0 parking. I've never advocated for 0 parking. There will always be parking at these projects. I've advocated for 0 parking minimums and actually for parking maximums. So I think we should really be not having any minimum parking requirement, and we should have a parking maximum. And, you know, ideally for me, that would be a 0.5 spaces per unit maximum. And the idea is to minimize vehicle use. We're trying to reduce vehicle miles traveled. Concept of induced demand is really important, that if you provide parking, then people tend to get more cars and, you know, end up using them and clogging your streets. You know, and there's a lot of information, a lot of studies that show that people that live in these big multifamily buildings don't have as many cars. And if we have transit access outside, if we have transit demand programs, if we have Clipper cards that are available to residents, and if we have great bike infrastructure and great bike rooms, then there are alternatives and people will use those. And Albany is a great city that you can walk across it in, very short time. You can ride across it in like 10, 15 minutes. And if we're on electric bikes, it's a great way to access the whole city, do your shopping, commute, whatever. So that's the direction we should be going, in my opinion. And not towards allowing more car parking, but reducing car parking, having more bike parking. And I think we should be reducing residential parking reductions, without having it as a concession for giving more bike parking. I think that's just kind of outmoded. I think it's irrelevant at this point. I'd be happy to, I think we should be requiring more bike parking, requiring transit passes. We should be asking projects that are of a certain scale to do it, or requiring a transit demand management program, so they can actually show what their demand is and what they're doing to offset it with certain requirements like providing transit passes. And parking should be unbundled, because why should we be forcing people to rent something that they don't want if they don't want to drive, they want to use bikes or walk or use public transit? I think it's coercive to force people to pay for a parking spot if they don't want it. In terms of bike parking standards, I agree with Mr. Peterson. I think it should be much higher. I think that's a really, really weak standard that's proposed there. I think it should be one bike space. Well, I'd be happy with one regular bike space per unit and one cargo bike space per unit. And I think electrical outlets should be provided at all bike parking stations. It's basically just provide outlets every 4 feet or every 6 feet, and they just need to be accessible, so you don't have to like jump over a bunch of bikes to plug in your charging cord. So it's not that difficult to provide a lot of outlets and make them convenient, so it's easy to use them, and make it basically that anybody who parks there with an electric bike can charge their bike. And some batteries come off, but it's sometimes a pain in the butt to take your battery off and carry it upstairs. So anything that makes it easier to charge your bike and go out and not use a car, that's what we should be doing. Let's see, other things. I think that's about it. I think I've come to the end of it. Thank you for letting me go on. But, since this is our only forum for actually talking about each one of these items, I think it's really important to address the ones we have concerns about. But I would finish by saying, yes, there's a lot of great work here, and I really am pleased with the way it's going. And if there were some more improvements, I'd be really happy with it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I do think it is an important discussion. The document is much more detailed now, a lot to talk to. So, staff thinks we should have extra meetings, or, we should have some way of generating written comments so that they're never shared with each other, but can all be put out on the website all at once. If staff has any creative ideas, otherwise, I think it's right. This is the forum, and we do need to give detailed input. So go ahead, Commissioner Momin.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm also of the same opinion. There is a lot to look at, a lot to comment on. And so if there is any other alternative to express our ideas, comments, I would be really happy. If not, I would go ahead and, provide my comments. Thank you, the consultant team and the city staff for putting together this draft. You have done a great job synthesizing and summarizing all these, past discussions and feedbacks into a comprehensive document. I appreciate all your efforts you have put in, working out land use policies, zoning changes, and design standards and guidelines, that will work together in achieving our future development goals. I think these development standards are really a useful tool for the city to ensure high quality building designs, particularly in regard to the project that would use the streamlined approval process using SB 330. So technicalities related to conformance with general plan aside, I think this is an excellent draft of the specific plan, and I support it totally. I will not go on endorsing each and every great aspect of it. There are too many of them. I will just comment on some specific items that I do not fully agree with, and the items that I have some suggestions for. Even that list is a bit long. But before going on, doing that, I have two small observations. One is two former planning commissioners, Megan Jennings and Chris Kent, worked on the early stages of the specific plan, and I do not see their names in the acknowledgement on page 2. So I think it would be good to include them. And then on page 35, figure 2.9, I think it is a typo. In the plan, we are showing opportunity sites, and it specifies that it is from 2015 to 2023 housing element site. I'm not sure if that is the intention. And if it is right, I think it would be more useful to show the opportunity sites that are part of the next housing cycle. Going to my comments on land use policies, LU5, I understand the advantages of in lieu fee and also the complexities related to inclusionary units for sale housing development. But I totally support encouraging on-site inclusionary housing units in affordable housing projects. It allows for more equitable distribution of affordable housing units, and also the city will get the affordable units incrementally in shorter time intervals rather than waiting for a long time for a large housing project to materialize. And then the housing policy LU8, it requires the commercial space to be at least 50 feet for a lot that is larger than 20,000 square feet. I think the consultant should look at it more carefully, on plan, because even if the lot is 20,000 square feet, it is possible that the lot depth might be just 100 feet. And with that, if the required commercial space depth is 50 feet, then parking behind that may not work because parking has to be at least 65 feet deep to work. Then next is land use policy 10, 5B. There is this diagram on page 43 on the lower right. It shows 68 feet height for a species zone lot that fronts public right of way. But there are very few, there are a lot of species zone lots that are through lots, and there is possibility that a lot of these species zone lots fronting Keynes and Adams would be consolidated, and so they would be actually 85 feet high. And so in that situation, we will get a scenario where there would be 85 feet high building on the one side, and then 28 feet high building structure on the other side of the street. And that, I think, is a big height difference. And so in that situation, I think it would be useful to have a larger step back above the 38 feet height. And I think because most probably these lots would be consolidated, so they would have 200 feet depth. And so having a deeper step back at 38 feet would not be a major constraint for the project designs. But that would have a big impact on the feeling at the street level. And also, since the design guidelines, talk about one of the guiding principles about height and mass transition, this particular aspect would actually work against that. So I will request consultant to look at that. And then the next is item 6 under land use policy 10 on the next page. I support reduction of the required open space from 200 square feet to 100, but I think we should specify minimum site dimensions for the private and common open spaces so that the residual spaces are not designated as usable open space. We should have sizable open space which are really usable rather than small fringes around the building. And also there are a lot of different terms being used in relation to open space. We have usable open space, we have common open space, we have private open space, we have shared open space, shared publicly accessible open space, and so on. So I think it would be really useful to add a section that clarifies all these terms in terms of graphics or some text. That would be really useful in understanding the implication of each one. And then on the next page, we have this list of community benefits. I agree with all the items, and I understand that these lists could be updated in future. I just have 2 comments on these items. I think we need, as we discussed during the question and answer session of this meeting, we need more clarity on publicly accessible open space and required open space when the open space is part of a required amenity. And I also want to know if a mid-block connection is provided as a required amenity, would that also be counted as would it be counted as open space or not? That also would be better if it is clarified. And then in community benefit list B, I think item B, family-friendly housing, which requires 20% of units to be 3-bedroom units, I think is a big ticket item that could have a big impact on the ground floor area of a building. And these are costly units with maybe most probably 2 bathrooms and larger living room, dining room spaces. It might be, I think, worthwhile putting them in A list rather than a B list. And then moving next to the design guidelines, I agree most of the design guidelines and standards. I think all of these design guidelines are really essential in creating a better urban environment. They're all thoughtful and reasonable. I don't think they are too prescriptive and do not pose as many major constraints. There is a good balance of control and flexibility. Specifically talking about the guidelines of SD1 mid-block pedestrian connection, I think it is a great idea. I really like it, and we should really encourage having more mid-block connections from Keynes and Adam Street to coming to San Pablo Avenue. That would really improve the walkability along the corridor. However, I think 10 feet width is not really enough. It will not provide much space for landscape and also for privacy of spaces along those pathways. And they would also look like, most probably these would be on consolidated through lots. And so they would be 200 feet deep and 10 feet wide. They would look like a long tunnel. And we are also allowing them to be covered. So they are basically tunnels. And so I think I would request looking at that in terms of width. Either we should increase the width to something like 15 feet, or we should have an average where these mid-block connection could be part of overall open space system. They could be part of courtyards or part of the plaza in the front of the building. And they could be narrow, about 10 feet, minimum 10 feet narrower at some point, but they could be wider at different locations. So they would not feel as if kind of narrow tunnels. And then next is SD13. We have specified this minimum 50% of the active frontage. I agree with Commissioner McLeod. It should be longer than that. It could be longer than that. But I think we should also include, corner lots where they will be fronting San Pablo Avenue as well as a side street. And in that situation, the whole San Pablo Avenue frontage could be active, and the side street could be used for parking entrance or utilities and things like that, which would not be considered as active. And then next is BD4. Sorry. I think for these, I'm okay with these 100 feet massing breaks after 100 feet, but I think having just 2 feet deep break doesn't really, make an impact. It will not even look like a break. I think it should be at least 3 to 4 feet deep and maybe at least 6 to 8 feet wide, so that it kind of breaks the bulk of the building, a more effective way rather than just superficial. And similarly, the 6-inch depth of the facade plane change would really be negligible. It should be at least 18 inches to make an impact. Next is BD24. So BD24 talks about design massing to minimize appearance of height difference. I think we should make this a mandatory, a design standard, since we are having these taller 68 feet or 85 feet buildings along San Pablo, and in many locations they will be also fronting Adam Street and Kane Street with really shorter 28 feet tall buildings across those streets. I think we would have these issues, more frequently to deal with. And I think it would be really helpful if we make this as mandatory design standards, so that the designers would make effort to make the massing less dominant, less imposing for the structures across the street. The next is BD 30, shared open space requirements. I think it would be useful to have minimum dimensions specified for these. And then more important, BD 31. I'm not sure about my fellow commissioners, but I think I'm not very comfortable with allowing 40% of the shared open space to be covered, and that too with a minimum height of the ceiling at just 8.5 feet. That would not feel like an open space. I think either we should reduce the percentage of the covered open space, or we should substantially increase the minimum height requirement of the ceiling above the open space. Then it would be effective. I have seen some design guidelines where double height spaces could be considered as open space. Just single floor height space would not be very effective as a common open space. It could be a balcony or something, but that would be a private open space and really small. But if we are talking about shared open space, that means common open space, and they are supposed to be larger. So I think allowing them to be covered for like 40% is not really meaningful. And then the last is BD 30. BD 32, there is just a discrepancy. In the text, we are specifying minimum width 30 feet for these courtyard spaces, and in the diagram shows 35 feet. So it should be corrected. And then in infrastructure, INF3, here we are talking about on-site stormwater management. I think it should be made part of, a required amenity. We have all electrical buildings as part of required amenities in list B, but I think having on-site stormwater management is a really, a great sustainable feature to maintain the quality of runoffs. And I think we should really encourage that more actively, and at least, making it part of our required amenities would be, a good step towards that. And then the last on the infrastructure, item MOB1. 1B transit passes. We have discussed this item a couple of times before. There has always been some discussion on the dollar value of the transit passes. So I think there should be some mechanism to work out the dollar value of the transit passes so that it is really effective rather than just a token. And I think instead of in addition to providing one transit pass to one unit, I think we should provide more than one transit pass for the larger units like 2 bedrooms and 3 bedrooms, because one transit pass for residents in studio would not be the same as one transit pass for like 5 people living in 3-bedroom unit. So that's all. I think overall it's a great partial culmination of our work so far. I really appreciate all the efforts you have put together in this. Thank you.
Thank you. Some great comments there. So I'll go ahead and start my comments and start with a few that Commissioner Momin has said. One is that, very good point about, one transit pass is not equivalent. Saying transit pass would not be equivalent value to a smaller unit versus a bigger unit, definitely. In terms of the covered open space, that's a good catch. Now, maybe I can just ask the consultants. What I'm thinking you might have meant by that is perhaps some covering for rain so that the open space could still be used in inclement weather. Was that the intention?
That could be one of the things that could be covered, or umbrellas or any of those kinds of things, but those are typically not thought of as permanent. So I think the comments that we heard today are very good ones. So, yeah. Okay, yeah, because I think shades or umbrellas for inclement weather would be good, but yes, the 8-foot height covered space does feel a bit close. There's a close feeling. It doesn't feel like open space. Okay, let's see. One moment. By the way, I just want to say, I think it's on page 27. There's a photo by Commissioner Donaldson that is just gorgeous. Kudos to you for that photo. Love that. It makes Albany look pretty awesome. And let's see. Speaking of, Commissioner Momin spoke of those mid-block crossings. I thought that was an awesome idea. I'd love to see that in there. I think that can be a very important feature, but I agree with his comments that a 10-foot wide covered, especially if it could be a covered passage, could be
not not feasible or not appropriate. It wouldn't serve its purpose very well. So 15 feet minimum sounds good for that. And in the staff report, so I got when I read through this, and apologies, I don't have the page number references here, but the staff report, not the actual plan, states ground floor access and design standards to facilitate active and vibrant frontages for commercial uses and privacy for residential uses. Didn't quite understand how privacy for residential uses snuck in there if we were now saying it's all going to be commercial on the ground floor. So you might want to look at that statement in the staff report, or if you want to clarify that now, please do. But
sure, I can clarify quickly that it's really about the side streets in Keynes and Adams that may have individual residential units on the ground floor, which frankly we're encouraging as sort of a typology that's more in the character of Keynes and Adams. And so what those standards talk about is not having like a abrupt entry onto the street, but that there may be a little bit of a private moment that happens at the street level, whether it's a stoop, like you see at the new Keynes townhomes, or some other kind of little landing entry.
Oh, okay, that's what specifying. Okay, great. That makes sense now. So on just a couple of big topics. Yeah, I agree with those who have spoken up about the sustainability aspects, that we're throwing in sustainability aspects like solar panels as amenities, whereas I think that's maybe in very short order, those are going to be base level requirements for new construction. Already for new housing construction, I believe solar panels are required. And so having solar panels and electrification as amenities doesn't feel very good to me. I feel like we should have at least a very strong emphasis that those things are expected, and that who knows, our code might very well change that we institute a gas ban like many other cities have done, and including neighboring cities. And in that case, we wouldn't be talking about gas at all. So I think we definitely want to de-emphasize any gas infrastructure and discourage gas infrastructure. The city will save money by not having to worry about that infrastructure. And then what I've heard is it's savings for the developer as well. So I think that the sustainability features ought to be somehow strongly, if not required, it ought to be very strongly worded that these are to be expected in the plan. And part of the sustainability, and as I think as Commissioner McLeod said, and staff said, times are changing, and we understand that sustainability and land use and transportation and housing, this is all connected. And what's sustainable is when we don't require that everyone have a car, but encourage people not to have cars. And one of the ways to encourage that is to make sure we have excellent bicycle facilities and excellent bicycle parking and storage. So it does not feel good to me to add more bicycle parking or higher bicycle standing as amenities as well. And in fact, I'm in favor of what Commissioner McLeod said, is that we should specify two bike parking spaces per unit. After all, much cheaper to build a bike parking space than a car parking space. And if a household is considering ditching a car, then it's likely that they wouldn't have one bicycle, or wouldn't share one bicycle, that they would, perhaps every member of the household would have a bicycle. So it's not really realistic to equate those. It's very likely people who are making the active decision to have bicycles will each have one of their own. So I would be very strongly in favor of 2 spaces per, and including, I think Commissioner McLeod said one of those be a long tail space. Plus e-bikes are just exploding. I just see them everywhere, and the discussion is exploding about people getting them. And I see people, people they're showing up overnight in people's houses. So having charging facilities is just going to be a requirement. And if cars are going to electric, which I believe they are, and that's a requirement, then electric vehicle charging stations, we ought to revisit our requirements for that, because it could be that all these spaces, all the parking spaces provided in a development should be at least EV ready. If these are multi-family units, and these are the only places that people are going to charge, or one of the only places that they can charge. So I think we need to have again heavy emphasis on sustainability, and it's not just and it shouldn't just be amenities that get thrown in. I want to talk about nodes a little bit, and maybe it's not really a node question, but when I look at it, especially the western side of San Pablo from Solano to the border, I don't know why we wouldn't oh, sorry, I just realized, okay, so just confirming again, we are saying that the only node that is going to have the higher height limits is the northern node, correct? Yeah, I'm getting nods, okay. So, so that means that along San Pablo, on the western side from Solano to the border, that seems like a place, an area is ripe for redevelopment. In fact, there was a discussion of there's a discussion in the plan of potentially redoing City Hall, or maybe even moving City Hall. And I think that that's wise. And it also seems like, especially from the border to where the Albany, I don't know what you call it, the Albany Mini Mall, or where Domino's Pizza is, or not Domino's, but Round Table Pizza is, and the donut shop is. It seems like that area would be ripe for taller buildings as well. From there all the way to the border, because we've already got the taller building at the border, the senior housing. So I think we ought to consider, maybe an 85-foot height limit on that west side of San Pablo. Up to that area, because it would not be encroaching on any other. That would be the area where there's not a lot of neighboring structures there, and in fact, on the corner of Adams and the Little Buchanan Spur, there's already a 3-story apartment building. So something to consider. And then let's see, I think I might be almost done. Yeah, this is something that I brought up before. I'm not sure I brought it up in public comment before, but I brought it up with staff, is that it says required unbundled parking for rental housing. But I do believe it can be done for condo developments as well. So I don't see why if we're going to go with unbundled, and I think the majority of the commissioners want unbundled, why wouldn't we specify it for condo developments as well? I know that I personally have examples of people who have unbundled condo spaces, and some of them go ahead and sublease it, or don't use it. So I would like that to be considered. Mixed use in lieu, okay, mixed use and in lieu fee. So yeah, I'm in favor of mixed use. I'm a little worried though. I just hope that it pencils out along the entire corridor. If it does, great. But if it means that we are not getting development because developers don't want to build commercial on the ground floor, I'll be a little bit, I'd be a little bit sad that would prevent a development. But I guess maybe the jury's out on that. We don't know. I'd like the idea of maybe keeping the option open of having some lots non-commercial on the ground floor. But I do understand that having the mixed use will keep the corridor vital in general, and that we really want that. But I'm concerned about empty storefronts, but maybe I'm just too worried. And then in terms of the in lieu fee, yeah, I agree that should be high. And the issue with that is, and I see the point about it being able to go directly towards supportive, affordable housing. But that process will take a very long time. Whereas if we require it out of the developers up front, we'll get it in a few years versus maybe 10 or 15 years. When I was on the council, we approved the all affordable development at Washington, and we approved that a number of years ago, and it's still, no ground has been broken. And that's not because of anyone's fault. It's just because that's how long these things take. It takes so long for them to raise the money, get the grants and funding and all that. So that's just one concern with putting all of your affordable stuff into an in lieu fee bucket. So I would want to make sure that every developer doesn't just choose the in lieu fee, because then we wouldn't get any affordable units quickly. And finally, well, two more things. I think Commissioner McLeod had a very good point about tapering the transitions. One thing you're hearing from the public is that they're seeing 6-story buildings against Adams and Keynes, and they're thinking, oh my God, there's 1-story, 2 buildings there. So I think that's why Commissioner McLeod, I don't want to speak for him, but I think that's why he's saying, well, how about, R3 and R2 zoning? If we raise the height limits there, then that kind of makes it natural transition down to the R1 zoning. So, that's a big deal, something to consider, whether or not there's some small tweaks we can make there to help with the transitions. And then finally, I very much agree that we should not have parking minimums, and we should have parking maximums. And so I think Commissioner McLeod and I are in agreement on this. And so I wanted to throw out a little straw poll to see if any of the other, if Commissioner Momin or Commissioner Awadi had any desire to change from 1 parking space per minimum to either no minimums or something else, or if Commissioner Momin and Wadi are comfortable with, and I'm leaving out Commissioner Donaldson because he's already stated his intentions here, or if Commissioner Momin and Wadi are still want to stick with the 1 space per minimum. And I'll ask Commissioner Momin to speak first, since I'm asking him directly.
Yeah, I remember some previous discussions where we had this, a rubric for decision making, and in that we had specified our preferences, and I think most of us had specified 1 maximum and no minimum. So that I would support, having maximum 1 parking space per unit, and depending on the concessions and waivers they get, whatever parking is provided and whatever parking the market condition allows, that would be happening in those individual development projects, but it should not exceed 1 per unit.
Okay. Well, I certainly would support that, and perhaps Commissioner McLeod would too, and that would be a majority of us looking for 0 minimum and suggested maximum from Commissioner Moment of 1. Since I addressed you directly, Commissioner Wadi, did you want to speak at this time or not?
I feel we kind of exhausted these conversations when we had these topical discussions and did that rubric. So I don't have anything to change from those more detailed. So I thought tonight was kind of more of an overview of synthesizing the comments that we already provided. So I don't have any changes to the comments I previously provided. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. And so I just want to note for staff that I do see 3 commissioners who in favor of 0 minimums and 1 space per. And I can agree with 1 space per maximum. And Commissioner McLeod, thanks for your patience. You've had your hand up, so go ahead, please.
Yeah, I just want to, Commissioner Moman's comments and Chair Pilch's comments, made me think a little more about the community benefits list as well. And I agree that the all-electric construction shouldn't really be on that list. I think it should be something that we require as a city. It's moved forward through various lawsuits with the city of Berkeley. It's at the federal level, I think. And in the meantime, dozens and dozens and dozens of other cities have adopted all electrical ordinances. So I think that's what we should be doing. And also on, let's see, on list A, I think item C is a bit problematic because doing anything on San Pablo is really difficult, as I've been watching the ACTC process go forward and just watching our Transportation Commission try to get any changes on San Pablo, all approved by Caltrans. It's really a difficult thing. And I don't, just building a bus stop, I think that's also pretty much AC Transit's responsibility. So I don't really see that as being a really reasonable, feasible kind of item to have on that list. And if it's in terms of bike lanes or bike facilities, that's a citywide thing. It's not a piecemeal thing. So unless there's some really specific examples of what could be done with item C, I don't even think it should be on the list. I think with the Berkeley Bowl project, we talked about a bike lane somehow on the side street or making the sidewalk wider. To facilitate pedestrian access. But, unless we have some more specific examples, I think actual changes on San Pablo are not really that doable by a small project or one project. And then, I'm a little skeptical about the public art it is definitely a community benefit, but I don't see why we would be, I don't know. I don't think that should be there. I think that should be its own item. Developers can decide if it's on site or not. I don't know if we should be giving something away for that. It seems like they're already required to do something for art. So why should we give them something additional when they're already required to do it? And then with item D on list B, basically nobody does solar hot water panels anymore. It's not really cost effective. It's a difficult system to work with. And on-site photovoltaics are required. Maybe if we, that's part of our green building ordinance now. So I don't think we should be giving something away for that. That's also required, unless it goes like way beyond the minimum requirement. And I'd have to go look back at the ordinance to see what the minimum is and see if there's some trade-off we could ask for a maximum roof coverage or something. And then similar with item E, it's already required in our green building ordinance from what I remember. Everything's supposed to be EV charging. Well, they're all EV charging ready. So I don't know, that one we could look at, but I think it is also something that's going to be mandated. And I guess we can modify this list over time. But I think some of the sustainable ones are already required to a great extent. I know there's a certain number of EV charging stations required, but EV ready, I think it already is required. So I don't think we should be giving something away for that either. So I think that list needs some more thought or more careful consideration. And then just lastly, on the subject of mixed use, I mean, the reason I really support commercial spaces along the ground floor is that it's all part of the urban, walkable, livable city where you want goods and services on your street, outside your door. We don't want to go drive to Costco or, you know, when you can get something that, you know, it's just making it accessible to get what you need in your own space, in your own city. So that's why I support it. You know, economics are difficult for retail, but at the same time, even if it's other goods and other services, it helps, I think, you know. So for that reason, I absolutely support commercial development along the whole corridor. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks. Since you addressed me, yeah, I'll say it's not a hill I'm going to die on. I understand about the mixed use. And about the amenities, yeah, I'd say that it falls into two categories. Thank you for looking at those in detail, Commissioner McLeod. If we already require them, then it's not an amenity. It should be removed from the list, obviously. And if it's going in a direction where the city is going to go policy-wise anyway, or where the state's going to go, where they're going to require these things, well, then it's not going to be an amenity either. It's going to be it's not going to, we're not going to get anything out because it's going to be required in the near future anyway. So I think we need to take a close look at those lists and certainly throw out anything that's already a requirement in the code. So, okay. Well, we might be wrapping up just before we would have had to continue the meeting. So, but I don't want to stifle any more discussion or conversation. Any last thoughts? Otherwise, thank you once again for the work and the presentation and for sitting through all of our comments. And let me see, I lost my agenda here. I think this is the last item on the agenda. No new business. Yes, that was item 7. So we'll move on to, and there's no action needed. So we'll move on to item 8, which is no new business. Next meeting, March 23rd. But we did hear that, so it sounded like March 21st, this will go to the council, or what was the date? March 21st?
At the moment, that is the plan. I'm not exactly sure at what time, and the agenda will be posted next Wednesday as usual. So if nothing changes from where we are today, there will be a study session on this plan as well as on the housing element. It would be kind of a combination study session for the council. And we'll bring the results of that back for you to chew on. There'll probably be some things that will go in different directions than any of you have been talking about. So that will be an interesting follow-up discussion. We'll decide when that is down the road a little bit. But for your next meeting on the 23rd, we are anticipating having another housing element work session as well. So lots of policy discussions to continue.
Yes. Very good. Well, seeing no further items on the agenda, then I'll thank everyone once again for a great meeting and wish you all good night.
Okay.
Thank you.
Meeting adjourned.
You're right.